Some of our listeners will be surprised to hear the idea that culture is not neutral, as we discussed during the episode. There's a lot of language in churches today about reclaiming or redeeming the culture. I think of this in particular, like around certain holidays that may or may not be mentioned in a second. How would you advise Christians toward this end, or would you advise them to try to reclaim and redeem the culture?
Yeah. So I would respond in a couple of ways. Number one, I'm hesitant to use the word redeeming culture mainly because in Scripture, God redeems individuals through Christ, and there's never any command for believers to redeem culture or anything, right? That individuals are redeemed. And when individuals are redeemed, then they begin to live out their redemption, and that affects our behavior, which again, I would define that's what culture is. Culture is our behavior. So I don't want to use that term, for that reason. But then I want to ask, well, what does someone mean when they say it, when they say redeeming culture? In my experience, usually what that means is something like this. We take some pop song that's, about drugs and sex and all this sort of stuff. We take out the words and we put in words about loving Jesus, and all of a sudden, magically, we've redeemed culture. Well, no, we haven't. That would be like if before I was a Christian, I was verbally abusive to my wife. I'd come home, I'd scream at her, I'd yell obscenities. And then after I'm a Christian, I come home and I tell her I love her, but I do so as I scream at her and, in a harsh tone of voice. If you want to really redeem something, if you want to really change something, then it needs to change, not just the words, but also the tone, also the way that we express something. So, yes, absolutely, we ought to be transformed as believers and how we act and how we worship. But that means it all ought to be transformed. So, usually people are like, well, then, the unbelievers do this, and can't we redeem it? Well, again, let's redeem music for God's glory, if you want to put it that way. I wouldn't use that word, but okay, let's do that. Let's transform music. But if we're going to transform music, it's going to transform, right? It's not going to be the same thing. So, and this is all rooted in this idea that culture is neutral and expresses values. And so, as I said in the episode, that doesn't mean that everything unbelievers do is inherently bad. We might look out in the culture and find a person who composes a song, and musically and textually it's noble and good, and because they're made in the image of God and common grace, and we can embrace that, absolutely. But if something has been produced that is embedded with anti-Christian values, to redeem that or transform that or use that for Christ would mean a complete transformation of that expression in conformity with biblical values and in honor of the Lord.
I guess the example I'm thinking of in particular, and maybe this doesn't exactly fit in with the question, but for example, a lot of hymn tunes that we use today are rooted in folk music.
Yes.
And a lot of that folk music wasn't about the best of things. But to be fair, nobody could probably even remember what those folk tunes were originally talking about. Now we only associate them with the hymns that have lived generations on past that time. And obviously that's been such a blessing to the church because folks knew that tune already. They could pick it up and they could sing exactly what the pastor had written for that week, or whoever the hymn writer was, and they could sing it without it being disorganized and all that stuff.
Yeah.
But that's something that the culture was doing. I guess that would be my only, not pushback, because I'm not pushing back on anything you said, but an example of something that I would wrestle with.
Yeah. Well, so a couple thoughts on that. Number one, I mean, it's actually not true that a lot of our hymn tunes were just taken directly from secular songs, or even folk songs. Like a lot of people talk about Luther that way. Like Luther just used bar tunes, which is not, well, he did use bar tunes, but what a bar tune is not a tune that comes from the tavern. when your hymn textbook talks about bar tunes, it's talking about German bar form, which is AAB. There's a phrase of music. That phrase of music is repeated, and then there's a contrasting phrase. That's called German bar form. And many of Luther's tunes were written in that form, which was not him taking a song from the bar. And did he take the melody from secular love songs you hear and use them as a melody in the church? Well, actually, he only did it one time, not a gazillion times like you might assume with a discussion. And when he did, the original lyrics were so distracting to people, within a couple of weeks, he just got rid of it and wrote a new tune. So it's actually not accurate to say that historically we've just taken tunes and put new words to them. Rarely have hymn writers done that. But you are correct in that in most of church history, hymn tunes resembled the folk tunes of the day. But that gets to something I said in the episode about the fact that the folk music of those eras was shaped by biblical Christian values. And so even the love songs or the songs about life expressed and embodied a certain nobility that was also accessible for the congregation, for the average people. And so many, a lot of hymn writers found that kind of tune was well suited to expressing noble truth in an accessible, singable way. And absolutely, those are good things that we ought to be doing.
Yeah. Poor Luther, he did it one time and now everybody's on his case.
Yeah.
I hope you enjoyed that bonus clip from the most recent episode of the Hymnpartial podcast. Make sure you go over to hymnpartial.com to sign up for our free weekly newsletter. And if you're watching us on YouTube, go ahead and hit subscribe and ring the bell so that you don't miss another episode.